It was supposed to be a quiet, ordinary afternoon in Sarah's life, a brief moment of respite before the chaos of everyday life consumed her once more. Her son, Jake, was playing in the front yard, as he often did. At 10 years old, he wasn't like the other children in the neighborhood. Jake had been born with a disability that made it difficult for him to communicate, but that never stopped him from wanting to be outside, enjoying the simple pleasures of fresh air and sunshine. He was content in his own world, bouncing a ball against the garage, humming to himself, his face lit up with the joy of his small, solitary world. Sarah, ever watchful but wanting to give him some space, sat inside with the front door cracked open. She could hear the gentle thwack of the ball against the concrete driveway, a sound that should have been comforting. But the sharp, sudden knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone. A quick glance out the window revealed 2 uniformed officers standing on her front porch. Confusion rippled through Sarah's chest as she quickly got to her feet and opened the door. "Good afternoon, Mom," the taller officer said, his voice polite but firm. "We've received a call about your son." The mention of Jake caused her stomach to tighten. Was something wrong with him? Was he hurt? Panic began to claw at her chest. "What do you mean? What happened?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's been a report," the officer explained, his eyes scanning the yard where Jake was still bouncing the ball. "It says your son was left outside unattended and is at risk. We need to ask you some questions." A wave of disbelief washed over her. Her mind raced. Unattended. She had been sitting just inside the door the entire time, watching Jake through the open crack. She knew every inch of his routine. This wasn't a situation of neglect. It was simply Jake being Jake, doing what he loved, under the watchful eye of his mother. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, trying to control the shock that crept into her voice. "I'm right here. I've been keeping an eye on him the whole time." The officer gave her a tight-lipped smile, his gaze lingering on Jake for a beat too long. "It's just procedure, ma'am. We need to check everything out. Someone made a complaint, and we have to investigate." Sarah's mind spun. Someone made a complaint. She hadn't seen or heard anything unusual from the neighbors, nothing that would have prompted a call to the police. The idea of anyone complaining about her son seemed unfathomable, especially considering how open and supportive the neighborhood had always been toward families like hers. But as she looked closer at the officers, she noticed something else. Their demeanor wasn't just polite, it was practiced. They had been here before. Her stomach churned as realization began to set in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately made the call, and they weren't just accusing her of neglect. They were accusing her of something far more insidious, something she hadn't even seen coming. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them stepped forward. "We'll need to speak with your son, ma'am, just to ensure everything is all right." Every instinct inside Sarah screamed that something was terribly wrong. Who would do this? Why would anyone make such an accusation? But before she could ask, the officers took a few steps toward the yard, their eyes locked on Jake, who continued to bounce his ball with blissful ignorance of the growing tension. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen at the door. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. Then, just as one officer opened his mouth to call to Jake, the front door slammed shut behind Sarah. Someone was out to get her. And this wasn't just about her son anymore. This was war. As Sarah closed the door behind her, her heart thudded against her chest like a drumbeat. Her instincts screamed that something was off, that this call wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. She turned quickly to look at Jake, still unaware of the storm brewing around him, his carefree laughter echoing through the open window. But Sarah knew this was no ordinary complaint. Someone had orchestrated this, and it wasn't just a random act. This was personal. Her mind spun, but her lawyer's instincts kicked in, overriding the chaos that threatened to consume her. Who would do this? Who would make such an outrageous claim about her son? The HOA. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. For months, she had noticed strange looks from certain members of the neighborhood, hushed whispers when she walked by. The whispers had always felt off, as if someone, some unseen force, was watching her every move. It wasn't just that Jake had special needs. No, it went deeper. It was her. It was always about her. Sarah had been an attorney for over a decade, a prosecutor who had seen it all. But there was something uniquely unnerving about the HOA board members, a clique of suburban elites who hid behind their power and influence. They had too much control over the neighborhood, and Sarah had always been suspicious of their motives. There were rumors about them, how they had a habit of targeting families who didn't fit their narrow view of what was acceptable, and Jake, with his disability, had become an easy target. Sarah's blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. The HOA had been quietly plotting against families like hers, families with children who didn't fit into their cookie-cutter world. But what made her even more uneasy was the thought that someone from within the HOA had made that call. Someone who had the power to twist the truth and make Sarah's life a living nightmare. Her suspicion turned to Greg Sanders, a senior board member known for his cold, calculating nature. Greg had always been a stickler for the rules, to the point where it bordered on obsessive. Sarah had always brushed him off as an overzealous neighbor with too much time on his hands. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching her family for far longer than she had realized. Determined to get answers, Sarah began her own investigation. She didn't have the luxury of time. Jake was her priority, and now her reputation and future as a prosecutor were at risk. She couldn't let the HOA destroy her family over a fabricated accusation. She pulled out her laptop and started digging. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The HOA had been collecting complaints about families for years, most of them involving children who were different in some way. Sarah found records of fines issued for minor infractions, all cloaked in the guise of neighborhood upkeep or enforcing the community standards. But behind these records, Sarah found something much darker. There it was, a secret dossier, neatly organized, detailing complaints against families with special needs children, including hers. Each entry, each accusation, painted a picture of parents who were difficult or disruptive to the HOA's pristine image. And at the center of it all was Greg Sanders, orchestrating everything from the shadows. The more Sarah dug, the more she realized the depths of their manipulation. Greg hadn't just made the call. He had been feeding false information about her family to other neighbors, poisoning their perception of her, painting her as an irresponsible, neglectful mother. The twist was even darker. Someone close to Sarah, someone she had trusted, had been feeding him information about her every move. Her breath caught in her throat as she reread the lines of text, each word a revelation. There, in black and white, were references to private moments with Jake, things no one but her would know. How had they been watching her so closely? Who was leaking this information? The questions piled up, the answers elusive. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a call made by an anonymous neighbor. It was part of a calculated, vicious campaign to destroy her family, and it had been going on for far longer than she'd realized. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, her hands shaking. She couldn't let them win. The tension in the air thickened as Sarah made a decision. This wasn't just about protecting her son. It was about fighting back against a corrupt system that used its power to bully the weak. And she, Sarah, wasn't going to let them get away with it. She was a prosecutor. She knew how to fight. And this time, it was personal. As she stood up, the quiet of the house felt suffocating. Jake's laughter continued to float in from the yard, blissfully unaware of the storm heading his way. But Sarah wasn't going to let him face it alone. The weight of what Sarah had discovered sat heavily on her shoulders. The walls of her home, once a place of safety, now seemed to close in around her. She couldn't escape the creeping suspicion that this wasn't just about her son or the HOA's overzealous rules. It was something far more personal. Someone had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But who? Who had turned against her? Her mind raced as she combed through the papers and documents she had gathered from her investigation. The more she read, the more it became clear. Greg Sanders was no mere stickler for rules. He was the architect of this malicious campaign, and he had been doing this for years. But there was something deeper than the HOA's rigid enforcement of community standards. Greg had personal reasons for targeting her family. What had she missed? Sarah spent sleepless nights trying to untangle the mystery. She started reaching out to old friends, colleagues, and even neighbors who might have information on Greg. One by one, she heard whispers, rumors about his past. Greg wasn't just some uptight board member. He was a man who had always felt entitled, a man who resented anyone who didn't fit into his vision of the perfect neighborhood. Sarah had never thought to question Greg's motives before. She had always chalked up his interactions with her as harmless, awkward at worst. But as she dug deeper, she uncovered a disturbing truth. Greg had a deep-seated hatred for anyone who didn't conform to his narrow view of the world, especially families like hers, families with children who couldn't fit into the mold of traditional suburban life. Jake was his target. Her thoughts turned dark as she recalled an uncomfortable exchange with Greg at a neighborhood meeting months earlier. He had made a passing comment about how certain children could be a nuisance to the neighborhood. At the time, Sarah had brushed it off as a strange remark, but now she saw it for what it truly was. An early warning, a glimpse into Greg's twisted mindset. The anger that had simmered beneath his cold exterior was now clear. He wasn't just angry at her son. He was angry at everything Jake represented. But it wasn't just Greg. No, Sarah realized with growing horror, someone else was involved. She had always considered her neighbor, Linda, to be a close friend, someone she could trust. But as Sarah dug deeper into the HOA's records, she found that Linda had been in constant communication with Greg for months. There were emails, texts, and even phone calls where Linda had discussed Jake's behavior, his playtime, and how she thought it was disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. Linda had betrayed her. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Linda, the woman who had been her confidant, had been feeding Greg information about her family, turning her back on their friendship in exchange for whatever twisted allegiance she held to Greg's vision. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than anything Sarah had felt before. Linda had become a willing accomplice in this campaign of hate, helping Greg to tear apart Sarah's life, all for the sake of a warped sense of order. Sarah was seething, but beneath the anger was a growing sense of resolve. The enemy wasn't just Greg anymore. It was Linda, too. The web of deceit they had spun around her family was thick, and every new revelation made Sarah more determined to unravel it. The real danger, however, lay in what they would do next. Now that Sarah had uncovered the truth, she knew they wouldn't back down. Greg's obsession with her family wouldn't allow it. They would escalate things further, trying to push her into a corner where she had no choice but to give in. But Sarah wasn't the type to back down. She had built her career on fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let two petty, vengeful individuals ruin her life. They had underestimated her, and now she was going to make them regret it. As Sarah sat back, her mind racing, she knew what had to be done. She would confront Greg and Linda. She would expose them for who they truly were. She would make them pay for every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to tear her family apart. But as she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation, a lingering question gnawed at her. Would the truth be enough to bring them down, or would they fight back harder than she ever imagined? The stakes were rising, and Sarah could feel the tension tightening like a noose around her neck. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The night was silent, but inside Sarah's mind, chaos raged. Every room in her house felt like a cage, its walls closing in around her. Linda, the woman who had been her closest confidant, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. And now, with this new discovery, Sarah knew she had to act fast. The HOA, led by Greg and his loyal accomplice, had set a trap, and she was already caught in its snares. But Sarah wasn't going to sit back and let them destroy everything she had worked for. She sat at her desk, staring at the stack of documents before her, the glaring evidence of her enemy's machinations. The emails, the phone records, the whispered conversations between Linda and Greg. It was all there, laid out like a map leading straight to the heart of the conspiracy. The only problem was that the map didn't tell her the next step. How could she expose them when every move she made felt like it was being watched? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She froze, her heart racing. Who could it be at this hour? There was no reason for anyone to come by now, not after everything that had happened. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police if necessary, but then the door creaked open. It was Linda, standing there, her face tight with something Sarah couldn't immediately place. Fear, guilt, or was it something more sinister? "Sarah," Linda began, her voice almost a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down Sarah's spine. She hadn't seen Linda in days, not since the last time they'd spoken. That conversation had ended with Linda's vague excuses about community matters and promises to help with the investigation. Now, Sarah knew that had all been a lie. "What are you doing here?" Sarah's voice was cold, steady. She wouldn't let Linda see how much she was rattled. "Not yet." Linda hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I need to talk to you. In private." There was something unsettling in Linda's tone, a mix of desperation and caution. But Sarah wasn't going to let her off easy. "Talk to me here. I'm not interested in anything you have to say." Linda took a step forward, lowering her voice even further. "I know what you found. About Greg. About me. But you need to listen to me, Sarah. It's not what you think. You're walking into a trap, and you don't even know it." Sarah's blood ran cold. A trap. She had been aware of the threat from Greg and the HOA, but the idea that Linda might now be warning her felt like a cruel game of cat and mouse. Could she really trust her former friend, or was this part of some deeper manipulation? "You've been feeding Greg information about me and Jake, Linda. Everything you've said has been used against us," Sarah replied, her voice icy, cutting through the tension like a blade. Linda winced, guilt flashing across her face, but then it was replaced by something darker. "I never wanted it to go this far. You don't understand the pressure, Sarah. They have more on me than you can imagine." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a small part of her still clinging to the possibility that Linda was telling the truth. "More? What do you mean? What have they threatened you with?" Linda shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at the door. She was trembling now, as if the weight of what she was about to say could break her. "They know things. About me. About my family. About things I'd done. Things I'd hidden for years." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "They have leverage, Sarah, and they won't stop until they get what they want. You're not the only target. I'm in this just as deep as you are, maybe deeper." The air in the room felt thick with tension. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was Linda genuinely trying to warn her, or was this another attempt to manipulate her into doing something she didn't want to do? "I don't trust you anymore, Linda," Sarah said, the words leaving her mouth with surprising force. "You've already proven you can't be trusted. But I will find out what you're really hiding, and I will make sure Greg doesn't get away with this." Linda took a step back, the color draining from her face as Sarah's words sank in. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. "There's no way out of this for either of us. You can't fight them alone." But Sarah didn't hear the rest of what Linda said. Her mind was already racing, piecing together the puzzle. Leverage. Threats. Linda wasn't just a victim in all of this. She had her own dark secrets, ones that made her just as dangerous as Greg. With Linda gone, Sarah sat in the silence that followed, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her desk. The trap had already been set, and now it was up to Sarah to decide whether she could walk away or whether she would fight, no matter the cost. The stakes were higher than ever before. The question wasn't just about exposing Greg and Linda. It was about surviving the storm they had created. The next few days felt like a suffocating fog for Sarah. The weight of Linda's warning hung over her, clouding her every move. She wasn't just fighting Greg and the HOA anymore. She was in a race against time, with hidden threats lurking in every corner, waiting to ensnare her. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah knew she had no choice but to take the fight to them before they struck again. Her first step was clear. She needed to confront Greg. Head on. She had the evidence, the emails, the phone records, everything she needed to expose him and his twisted campaign. But Sarah knew better than to walk into this fight unprepared. She was a prosecutor, and she knew how to build a case, how to make sure her enemy was cornered before they even knew what hit them. It was late one evening when Sarah decided to visit Greg's house. She had waited long enough. The sun had set, casting a dark, ominous hue over the neighborhood. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the distance. Sarah could feel her pulse quicken with each step as she walked up to Greg's front door. She wasn't just confronting him for herself. She was doing this for Jake, for everything they had endured. It was time to put an end to this. She rang the doorbell. The moment the sound echoed through the silent night, Sarah felt a jolt of adrenaline course through her veins. She wasn't prepared for the cold, calculating look that appeared on Greg's face when he opened the door. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone of something more sinister. "What a surprise. Come to talk about your son." "I'm not here to talk about Jake," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her eyes burning with determination. "I'm here to talk about you, Greg, about your little conspiracy, about the way you've been manipulating this whole neighborhood, using your position in the HOA to tear people apart." Greg's smile didn't falter, but something dark flickered behind his eyes. "Conspiracy. Now, Sarah, let's not get dramatic. This is about the good of the community, about ensuring that our standards are upheld." "Standards?" Sarah scoffed. "You don't care about standards, Greg. You care about power. You've been targeting families like mine for years, and I have the proof." She pulled a folder from her bag, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. It was full of documents, emails, text messages, and meeting minutes. She shoved it toward him. "You've been feeding lies to the HOA, using your position to manipulate people into believing things that aren't true. And now you've gone too far. You've dragged my son into this, and I'm done playing your game." For a moment, there was silence. Greg's expression remained unreadable, but Sarah could see the shift in his posture. He wasn't as confident as he had been. It was as if he could feel the walls closing in on him, the pressure of Sarah's words slowly sinking in. "You think you can take me down with this?" Greg's voice was a low growl now, barely concealing the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You think you've got it all figured out, but you're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Sarah's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to back down, but the threat in his voice was chilling. A bigger game. What did he mean by that? Before she could respond, Greg took a step closer, his face inches from hers. The smell of his cologne hit her like a punch, overpowering her senses. "If you think you can scare me, you're wrong. You have no idea what you're up against. People like you don't survive in this world, not when they get in the way of what's really important." The tension crackled in the air, like electricity before a storm. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't intimidated, not yet, but something inside her told her that Greg wasn't just talking about the HOA. He was talking about something far darker, something that could destroy her and everyone she loved if she wasn't careful. Before she could say anything else, Greg slammed the door shut, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, her breath shallow, her mind racing. What the hell was he talking about? Was this just a threat, or was there something more dangerous at play? Had she really underestimated just how far Greg and the HOA were willing to go? As Sarah turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from Linda. "Meet me at the park. It's urgent. I've made a mistake. They're coming for you." Her stomach dropped. What was Linda warning her about now? And why did it feel like the game had just taken a much more dangerous turn? Sarah's heart raced as she read the text from Linda. "Meet me at the park. It's urgent. I've made a mistake. They're coming for you." The words were a cold punch to her gut, sending a jolt of panic through her veins. What mistake had Linda made? And why was she suddenly warning Sarah? Everything felt wrong. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting in ways Sarah couldn't yet understand, and the more she uncovered, the more dangerous this game became. Her breath was shallow as she drove to the park, each mile feeling like it stretched into eternity. What if this was a trap? Linda had already proven she was willing to deceive Sarah to protect herself. She had betrayed her trust more than once. So why would Sarah take the risk now? The thought gnawed at her, but something deep inside her, instincts honed over years of legal battles, told her she had no choice. She had to know what Linda was planning. The park was eerily quiet when Sarah arrived, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of the wind through the trees. She parked her car under the dim glow of a street lamp and stepped out into the cool night air. The park seemed deserted, the shadows long and twisted in the moonlight. Sarah scanned the area, her senses on high alert. She hadn't come here to confront Linda. Not yet. She needed answers. "Sarah," a voice called softly from the darkness, and Sarah's pulse spiked. It was Linda. She emerged from behind a tree, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and guilt. Her hands shook as she clasped them in front of her, as if trying to keep them from trembling too much. She was nervous, desperate. "What's going on, Linda?" Sarah demanded, her voice steady, but filled with an urgency she couldn't hide. "You said you've made a mistake. What did you mean by that?" Linda glanced around, her gaze darting nervously, as if she were worried someone might be listening. "They've been watching you," she whispered, stepping closer to Sarah. "Greg and the others. They know what you've been digging into. They know about the evidence. And now, they're coming for you. It's not just about the HOA anymore. They're involved in something much bigger than that. Something that could ruin you." The words hit Sarah like a slap to the face. Something bigger. What was Linda talking about? Sarah had thought the battle was about exposing Greg and the HOA, but now Linda was suggesting there was an even darker layer to the conspiracy, something that went beyond petty neighborhood politics. "They've been planning this for a while," Linda continued, her voice shaking. "Greg has connections, people who can make things disappear. He's been using the HOA as a cover, but it's bigger. It's all part of a larger network, and you're in their sights now." The air seemed to thicken, the weight of Linda's words settling over Sarah like a dark cloud. Who were these people? What had she unknowingly stumbled into? And how was she supposed to fight against something so much more powerful than she had ever imagined? Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What do you mean by make things disappear?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda's face twisted in fear. "I don't know exactly, but I've seen enough to know that they don't care about the rules. They don't care about the law. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves, and if you get in their way." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This was no longer just a legal fight. This was something far more dangerous, something that could cost her everything. "Are you telling me they're planning to hurt me?" Sarah asked, her voice cold now, hardened by the fear and uncertainty that gripped her. Linda hesitated, her eyes darting back to the shadows. "I don't know. But they've already started moving, Sarah. And I don't think they'll stop until you're out of the picture." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp noise came from the bushes nearby. A rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. She froze. Someone was here. "Get in the car," Linda hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the road. "We need to get out of here. Now." Panic surged through Sarah, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Who else was watching? Had Greg sent someone to silence them? Or was this part of the plan, baiting Sarah into a trap? Suddenly, The sound of tires screeching reached their ears, and Sarah's stomach lurched. She looked down the street to see headlights cutting through the darkness, the car barreling toward them with alarming speed. "Move!" Linda shouted, shoving Sarah toward her car. But it was already too late. The vehicle skidded to a halt right in front of them, blocking their escape. The windows rolled down slowly, revealing two men who didn't look like they had any intention of letting them go. "We've been expecting you, Sarah," one of them said, his voice cold and void of emotion. The headlights of the approaching car burned bright, blinding Sarah momentarily as it screeched to a halt in front of her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but the figures in the car, two men, both with hard, unreadable expressions, had already trapped them. There was no way out. Linda was right beside her, her grip tight on Sarah's arm as the men stepped out of the vehicle, their movements calculated and cold. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his jaw, walked toward them with an unsettling calmness. His eyes locked on Sarah, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. "We've been expecting you," the man said, his voice low, almost predatory. Linda's breath hitched, and Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was something far more dangerous, something that could tear her entire world apart. "Who the hell are you?" Sarah demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the pounding in her chest. The man smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "We don't need to introduce ourselves, but we do need to have a conversation. A very important conversation." Sarah's mind raced. Who were these people? And why had they come for her? She was just beginning to scratch the surface of the HOA's corruption. Yet these men, these strangers, seemed to have a much bigger agenda. The last thing Sarah wanted was to play into whatever game they were trying to force her into, but she knew she had no choice. "Get in the car, Sarah," the man continued, his voice almost a command now. "We have a lot to discuss." The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Sarah glanced at Linda, who looked as if she might collapse any second. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling with unsaid words. Sarah's mind was already racing through her options. If they took her, it was over. She would lose everything, her career, her life, and the fight she'd started. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Sarah said firmly, her voice more defiant than she felt. "Whatever you're trying to do, it ends here. Now." The man didn't even flinch at her resistance. He stepped forward, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought he might pull out a weapon. But instead, he produced a small, plain envelope. He held it out to her. "Consider this an invitation, then," he said smoothly. "You can keep digging into your little HOA scandal, but you'll find that you've bitten off more than you can chew. You don't want to make this personal, Sarah. Trust me." With a cold, deliberate motion, he dropped the envelope into Sarah's hands. The weight of it felt wrong, like a trap that had already sprung. She stared at it for a moment, her breath shallow, before she turned the envelope over and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was of her son, Jake. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the image of him standing outside their house, completely unaware that someone had been watching him. The photograph wasn't taken from afar. It was a close-up shot, as if the photographer had been standing just a few feet away. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. They had been watching her family this entire time. Sarah's hand shook as she looked back at the man, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at her with that same unfeeling expression. But the silence between them felt oppressive, like a dark cloud that was about to swallow her whole. Finally, the man spoke again. "You have two choices, Sarah. You can walk away from this, pretend none of it ever happened, and we'll leave your family alone. Or," he paused, as if savoring the moment, "you can keep pushing. But if you do, the consequences won't just fall on you. They'll fall on your son, too." A chill ran through Sarah's veins. They were threatening Jake. She couldn't let this happen. Not to her son, not to anyone. But how could she fight back when they were this powerful? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to keep her emotions in check. She had no choice. She had come this far. And now, with Jake's safety on the line, she had to be even more strategic. "Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Sarah said, her voice low but unwavering. "You may have photos, you may have power, but you won't stop me. Not now. Not ever." The man's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured toward the car. "It's not too late to make the right choice, Sarah. But remember, whatever you decide, you'll never be able to go back." Before she could respond, he and his companion turned and walked back toward the car, leaving Sarah standing in the park, the weight of the photograph still heavy in her hand. Linda, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She stared at the photograph again, her mind racing. This was no longer just about exposing corruption or seeking justice. This was about protecting her son. And for that, she would go to any lengths. "I'm going to finish this," Sarah said quietly, her voice steely with resolve. "I'm not backing down. Not for anyone." As the men drove off into the night, Sarah knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. But she was ready. She had no other choice. The photograph of Jake still burned in Sarah's hands, its weight heavier than any evidence she had gathered so far. The threat was clear. If she didn't stop, they would target her son. Every instinct screamed at her to back down, to protect him at all costs. But there was something inside her, something fierce, unyielding, that told her she couldn't let this end with fear. Not when so much was on the line. Linda stood beside her, pale and trembling, but Sarah could see the flicker of resolve in her eyes too. The two women were now in this together, whether Linda wanted to be or not. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about justice, about making sure that no one else would ever have to face what they were up against. "We can't just let them win," Sarah said quietly, almost to herself. Her voice was steady now, the fire of determination burning behind her words. "I won't let them turn Jake into a pawn." Linda glanced nervously at the empty street around them. "What are you going to do? They're too powerful. We're up against people who don't play by the rules." "I know," Sarah replied. "But that's exactly why we have to play by a different set of rules." A plan was already forming in Sarah's mind. She needed leverage, something that would force Greg and the men behind him to back off. But what could she use? They had power, resources, everything to destroy her. And yet, she had one thing they didn't: the law. And she was a prosecutor. "I've been collecting evidence, Linda," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "Everything I need to bring them down. But now, it's not just about the HOA. It's about making sure these people never get the chance to hurt anyone else. We need to bring the full weight of the law down on them." Linda swallowed hard. "But they know about the evidence. They'll come for you again. Harder." Sarah nodded. Linda was right. They wouldn't stop. Not until they got what they wanted. But Sarah wasn't the kind of woman to back down from a fight. Not when she had everything to lose. "I'll have to make them think I'm backing off," Sarah said, a plan taking shape in her mind. "I'll have to make them think they've won. Just long enough to gather the last bit of evidence I need." Linda looked confused. "You're going to let them think you've given up?" Sarah gave her a grim smile. "Yes, it's the only way. I'll play their game, right up to the very end. And when they think they have me cornered, that's when we strike." She turned to walk away, but then paused. The stakes were higher than ever, but there was something liberating about this decision. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She'd come too far, and she wasn't about to give up now. That night, Sarah made the hardest decision of all. She would vanish from their radar. She would lay low, stop pursuing the evidence for just long enough to make them believe she had surrendered. She cut off all contact with Linda, stopped showing up at the places they'd been watching, and keep her family under the radar. But in the shadows, she would continue to build her case. No one knew how far the conspiracy ran, but Sarah was going to find out. She knew the risks, but she also knew one truth. These people were not invincible. They were human, just like her, and they could be taken down. As the weeks passed, Sarah played her part. She disappeared from the scene, acting as though she'd given up on the fight. But behind closed doors, she was still working, still gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. She had recorded conversations, secured documents, and uncovered links between Greg, the HOA, and even more powerful figures pulling the strings. Then came the day Sarah had been preparing for. The day she would reveal everything. It was late when Sarah stepped into the courthouse, her final evidence securely tucked into a briefcase. This was it, the moment she would bring it all down. She walked past the halls where the whispers of corruption and fear had once ruled her life, now feeling like an echo. Every step she took felt like a triumph. They thought they had won. They thought they'd forced her into submission. But today, the tables would turn. As she entered the courtroom, the same men who had threatened her family, the ones who thought they controlled everything, were seated on the other side of the room. They didn't even see her coming. Sarah stood before the judge, calm and collected, ready to drop the bombshell that would dismantle everything they had worked so hard to build. She opened her briefcase, revealing the documents, the photos, and the recordings. She had everything. The men exchanged glances, their smug expressions slowly fading as the truth hit them like a freight train. They were finished. Sarah couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. She played the long game, and she had won. Greg stood up, a look of disbelief in his eyes. But it was too late. The law was on her side now. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. The battle had been long, grueling, and dangerous, but she had fought with everything she had. And in the end, she had won. The twist was complete. The world that had once tried to break her was now the one that would fall. And through it all, Sarah had learned one thing. No matter how dark the fight, the light of justice would always shine through.